There's a prayer on top of the handout, as always. Please pray with me. O God, who wonderfully created and yet more wonderfully restored the dignity of human nature, grant that we may share the divine life of Him who humbled Himself to share our humanity, your Son, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Okay, we're going to do something a little bit different today. I'm going to talk a little more than usual. What I want to try to do is give us a quick overview of the whole Gospel of Mark, which obviously, in 40 minutes is going to be hard, right? But I think we can do a good deal of it, at least to about chapter 10, to just sort of see what's happening. Here's why. So obviously, in our New Testaments, Mark is not the first Gospel. Matthew is. That makes some sense. He's got that long genealogy. It's the most Jewish of the Gospels. It connects really easy to the Old Testament. So in the early church, about the year 300-400 or so in there, is beginning to put the New Testament together into a single book. They put Matthew first because it makes a lot of sense. It kind of, Malachi to Matthew works well, right? But as I've been saying the last couple of weeks, Mark is written first. And Matthew's actually this expansion of Mark. So we're going to talk about that and just what's going on with some of that. So Mark has the reputation, or has had the reputation historically, of being an inferior gospel. If you look at the history of the church and how people wrote commentaries on it or how they used it, it's the one used the least. Right? And there's a couple of, in fact, I've been reading a book. This is what I've been reading for part of my reading through the Gospels. It's called What is a Gospel? Chapter 3 is titled, How Did Mark Survive? Who's actually saying, why do we even have it if Matthew and Luke are these expanded, improved versions? Why did we even keep it, right? And the argument for that seems to be it gets associated with Peter. So why would we take Peter's gospel out of our Bible? Because he's like the most important apostle, right? But that's kind of why it survived. It got largely ignored. It hasn't really been until the modern period that Mark has gotten attention again, right? So we're going to just talk about why. One of the reasons, both why it has a bad reputation and why it's been given more attention in the modern period, is it seems like it's naive. It's really simple. It's got less sort of, at least on a surface level, less theology, right? If you read John, he's going to tell us right away Jesus is the Word who exists for eternity, who becomes incarnate. Matthew and Luke have these more complicated portraits of who Jesus is. Mark, again, seems pretty simple. So let's, at the kind of height of liberal biblical criticism in the 19th century, even a bit earlier, Mark was seen as this sort of pure, unadulterated gospel. This is the real story, and then we added all this theology and mythology to it. Most scholarship has now overturned that story. Now, actually, all that stuff is happening. We just have to look for it in a different way, right? It's also been judged inferior because if you read it in the original language of Greek, I've said this to you a couple times, he's not very good. Right? It's clearly not his first language. He makes errors. Right? His constructions are awkward. He switches between tenses. Have you ever heard a person who's pretty intelligent, but English isn't their first language? They'll get their past and present tense mixed up. Mark does that all the time. And our English Bible translations fix it because they want it to be good English. But actually he's making tense errors, right? He doesn't tell the story again on a surface level in a very creative way. It's like listening to a kid tell a story. First we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, and immediately afterwards we did this. That's how he comes off, right? It's then. There's not smooth transitions, right? So it seems like he's got a simple plot. It's a simple story being told by a simple person, right? I want to blow that up and actually say this is actually a really intelligent person who's writing this, and actually it's a literary masterpiece if we understand how to read it, right? A couple other things that he does that could possibly make us think that it's inferior. If you turn to the back of my handout, I've given you an outline of the whole gospel. This will help, right? It's kind of hard to tell from the outline, but if you go down to chapter 3, which I think is my point 3 under Roman numeral 2 there, A3, we get a chapter where, I title it A New Israel, A New Family, because Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees, arguing with his own family. The whole chapter is just controversies. In chapter 4, all he does is tell parables. In chapter 12, again, all he does is argue with people. In chapter 13, he gives us like this apocalyptic sermon, right? If you take this again at face value, it's like one day Jesus gets into arguments. The next day he tells parables. Then he gets into arguments again, and then he dies. Right? It's a very simple structure. It's not how our lives actually work, right? We do all kinds of different things in a day. So how he's organizing this isn't the way a person's life actually unfolds, right? We don't do all of these things in one a day, right? So it's been criticized as being crude in terms of being how the way that it's organized in its language. Again, a simple gospel written by a simple person. I want to argue that that isn't what's happening, right? So it's true he didn't know Greek well, that's fine, but there's some real artistic, interesting things happening, right? My metaphor for you is Mark is like a jazz artist who's being evaluated as if Mozart is the standard. Right? And he isn't trying to be Mozart. He's trying to be a jazz artist, right? Actually, Matthew and Luke, to a degree, understand what he's doing, and they pull him back when they rewrite their Gospels. They are pulling what they're doing back to a more standard style for that era, because they think he's being too innovative. So we're going to unpack a couple of these things, right? And two of them are actually those two parables you were talking about of the incomplete healings. Matthew and Luke don't have those because they're really bothered by them. We're going to talk about why, right? So a couple of things. Mark isn't just trying to tell us the story of Jesus. He's telling a story in which we're supposed to put ourselves in a story. It's more like a choose-your-own-adventure book. Who are you supposed to be in the story? So think about a book that you've read or a movie. Who do you identify with? You identify with the protagonist, the main character. So you watch, Star Wars, you identify with Luke Skywalker, right? That's who you are, right? By the way, this is why we need good movies and books with female leads and with non-white leads, right? But I'm saying this is how it's supposed to be told, right? You're supposed to identify with this main character. In the gospel, you can't identify with Jesus. He's God. He's here to save us. So we can't identify. We try to, but actually, if we read the gospel well, we're not supposed to identify with him. Who are we supposed to identify with? The disciples. That's who we are in the story. We should put ourselves in there. So I would actually title Mark's Gospel, I call it a drama of discipleship. Right? It's a play, a drama. We're supposed to enter into it as a disciple. And what we're doing in it is learning how to follow Jesus. He's our rabbi. That just means a teacher. We're disciples, which means, of course, a learner or a student. We're learning how to follow, right? So that's what this book is really about. It's a manual for discipleship. And as you read or hear, you're becoming a disciple. So it's not just a report, it's a story that you begin to embody, right? I think this is really powerful if we think of the original audience that heard this, if our history is right, is the church in Rome. This is where this gospel is probably written. Mark is Peter's disciple. He probably writes this down like soon after Peter has died. Right? So people, that first audience that hears it or reads it, and they hear, Peter say, Jesus asked Peter, "Who are you?" "You are the Messiah." And then 4 verses later, Jesus has to tell him, "Get behind me, Satan." They're all like, "I know that guy, that Peter guy. He was just here like a year ago," right? So they actually know these disciples, right? By the way, it's worth pointing out, they're really stupid in this book. Right? Matthew and Luke and John in his own way make them look better. Part of actually the story in Mark is they don't get it. They don't know who Jesus is. They don't know how to follow him. Who does get it? If you've been reading along, you're almost through it now, right? The demons get it. Who else gets it?
Peter
eventually, but the disciples takes him a long time. Like this is the tool that he uses. I say at the beginning of my handout, right? Irony is the literary tool he uses over and over and over again. It's a flip. Yeah, right. The outsiders get it, the insiders don't. That's the constant pattern. The demons know who Jesus is. The Gentiles know who Jesus is. Even the Pharisees get it a little bit more than the disciples. The insiders are clueless. They make mistake after mistake after mistake. Right? And he does, he's kind of mean, right? Like
you're using the word stupid.
Yeah.
But is that the right word? Ignorant?
Ignorant, I actually think he's intentionally being, it's irony with some humor in it. Well, that's the thing, we read the Bible and we're like, it can't be humorous. It's the Bible. But I actually think there's a sense here where he's depicting them in this over-the-top, you guys are just dumb, right? Kind of a way, right? Actually, if we fast forward real fast. So if you look at the front of my handout, the first passage I have in there is from chapter 7, and I've pulled out some verses. So the stuff that is in italics is me. But Jesus is talking to them, and he says, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." And then what they ask him is, "Jesus, we don't understand this. Can you please explain this parable to us?" It's not a parable. It's a straightforward teaching. Yeah, he's saying duh, right? It's just like he's giving them it's a straightforward, so but they do this a couple of times. When Jesus is speaking literally, they think it's a parable. When he's telling a parable, they think he's speaking literally. Right? He's doing this on purpose. The author is like framing it in this way to get us to see. They're just not very bright, right? Jesus responds, "Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer? All foods are clean." Right? He's basically saying, like, guys, don't you get this? It's just so easy. It is this. It's this duh. Like, how dumb are you? Right? We go down to chapter 8. So, Jesus has just fed the 5,000. He's walked on water. All these things have happened, right? So, they get into a boat again. Now, the disciples have forgotten to bring any bread, and they only had one loaf with them. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." They said to one another, "Is it because we have no bread?" So he's speaking in a parable, like, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. And I'm like, oh, he's mad at us because we didn't bring any bread. Right? And then what does he say? He goes, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes? The phrase, do you have eyes that fail to see, is like, are you stupid? Please understand. This is what he's doing. Right? And he's intentionally pointing out that they don't understand. That's the point of this. Right? So we'll come back to some passages. Right? So this is how it's being framed, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Back, we're the disciples of this. That's his us.
Yes, this is us. We're supposed to be. If what's happening in this book is we are being pulled into a story because we're now disciples of Jesus. We're going to follow him, right? What we're being told is, don't assume you get it. Keep following me, but you might be stupid too. Right? And be patient and listen and follow. Actually, we can stay here. The hinge of this whole book, that's in my outline, it's the very middle of the book, is the scene with Peter. When Jesus asked Peter, who do people say that I am? And they give all these different examples. And then Peter finally says, you are the Messiah. Right, that's the key of the book. We finally learned who Jesus is. So I know a sermon, I haven't heard it, but I know the topic was the mark and a secret. Jesus hides who he is constantly. Right, in terms of a book, right, the reveal is right here in the very, very middle of the book. Peter finally tells us who Jesus is. He's the Messiah. He's the Christ. Right?
Makes it even more kind of weird that Peter denies him.
It's 4 verses later, right? He doesn't deny him, but it's when he says, like, Jesus has to tell him, get behind me, Satan. Why?
Well, I don't still think he gets him.
No, he doesn't. That's the point.
He says he's Messiah, but I still think he thinks he's earthly Messiah.
Yes, he's got the right category now. But the problem is he's got a wrong definition of the Messiah. He partially knows. There's your 2 stories. Why does Jesus, these are the stories in chapter 7 and chapter 8, which occur right before. The first one is, there's a blind guy. I think I got the order right. Jesus puts the mud on his eyes. He says, I can see trees walking. I always want to go, how does he know what trees look like? But that's another story, right? And then Jesus does it again. He can see. And then we get the mute. I have turned them around. It's the mute is first, right? He puts his fingers in his ears, and he can kind of hear. And he does it again, right? Then we get the Peter story. It's the same thing. Peter half gets it. He can see the trees walking around, but he can't see clearly, right? Matthew and Luke don't get that's what Mark is doing. They don't understand the story, so they pull those out because they think it makes Jesus look like he's doing magic, and it didn't stick the first time. They don't actually understand that he's doing this literary thing. He tells us stories in which people get half healed, and Jesus finishes it, and then he has immediately afterwards, Peter says, "You are the Messiah." But then he goes, then Jesus tells him after that, he goes, "You're right, I am the Messiah." And he says, "And I have to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die." And Peter goes, "No, you're not." Right? Because he doesn't get it yet. That's what those stories are doing. It's a literary thing, right? So, Mark's actually really complicated. He's a literary artist who's using irony to tell a story. If you don't get that it's irony, you're like, I don't get why this story is here and this story is here and this story is here. It just seems like a random stories that have been slapped together. But he's got an order. He's doing these things, right? The problem with Mark, you have to work at it as a reader. You've got to figure out what he's doing. He doesn't explain things to you. Matthew and Luke explain. They actually pause and say, "You might not understand this, so let me explain." Mark is like, "Nope, I'm telling you a story, you make the allusions."
In a way, it's like, this is how we're going to live our lives.
Yeah.
We think we get it, and then we go the other direction.
Right.
And then, so we're all Peter.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's what we're being told is, we're all Peter. We're going to screw it up. We're going to misunderstand. Keep following. Right? If you follow Jesus, you'll get corrected. You'll come to a deeper understanding, just like Peter did. But I think there's also this message here of who do you follow? You follow Jesus. You don't follow Peter, unless Peter's got it right. I mean, there's also this warning here of like, be careful who you're following, right? Because ultimately you're supposed to follow Jesus. So,
Who do we think
a person named Mark. But this isn't always the case, but here we probably actually do have, it's probably a person named Mark, who, if we read around in Acts, was with Paul at first and Barnabas, and then he does something that makes Paul mad, and Paul says, I don't want you around here anymore. And it seems like he ends up with Peter, because you read 1 Peter and 2 Peter, and there's a Mark. So the tradition thinks there's this person, Mark, who's hanging out with Paul and Barnabas, who ends up hanging out with Peter in Rome. And so this is actually his recording of what he heard Peter preach.
Okay, because this Mark could not be a simple follower. He
Right.
had more background.
Yes.
And it's a relief to know that Peter got it so much better, or Peter, as
Yeah.
time went on, was able
Yeah.
to put that together, because this is far from being the simplest, shortest.
Absolutely. But it's also, again, I think it's worth pointing out, I mean, if this is Peter's gospel, Peter gets portrayed quite poorly in it. I mean, it's kind of an honest biography of, yeah, I screwed this up, guys. Right? But even so if we go back to the whole, Jesus, what does Jesus tell him? He says, get behind me, Satan. Right? The rebuke takes the same format as what he said in chapter 4 when he tells the wind and the waves to stop. It's the same kind of a command, right? So Jesus isn't a rebuke like, get behind me, Satan, you're bad. It's, you've got the order wrong here. I lead. Where's your spot? Back here. You follow me. You're trying to sort of be the leader and tell me what to do, like you have a plan, and I, God, I'm going to come follow your plan. No, it's not how this works. You get behind me and follow me now.
Is
Right.
John Mark the same as Mark?
Yes. Yeah. But that's what's happening in that scene. Again, it isn't a slap in the face, like you're bad. It's, you've got the order wrong here. You follow me. I don't follow you, right? Just like when Jesus tells the wind and the waves to stop, right? They listen because he's the boss. They get behind him and do what he tells them, right? So again, this is what's happening here, right? So I mean, this is it's especially up until chapter 8 here in what I call the first act in my outline. The disciples are constantly being depicted as unperceptive and dull, right? They don't see, they don't perceive, they don't hear, they don't understand, right? And what they need is an extra dose, just like these two healings that Jesus did, right? They need more, right? So then we get to chapter 8, we get this whole, there's a turn, right? We now know who Jesus is. As you read, the Mark and a secret doesn't completely disappear, but it gets less. Jesus stops telling people, don't tell them what I'm doing, right? Because the cat's out of the bag now. We know who he is. He's the Messiah, right? So this story is going to keep going. So again, Mark's interest is the discipleship. We as the readers or the heroes are being called to follow Jesus, right? So Mark depicts Jesus as a teacher, right? But if you compare it to, let's say, Matthew or even Luke, Jesus doesn't talk nearly as much. He acts more. He does healings, right? I think I skipped a part I wanted to highlight here. I think it's, my pages are out of order. Hold on. That's where I wanted to go. I didn't, but so the other thing I wanted to highlight is that in the first couple of chapters, a pattern gets established. 3 things happen, and these things kind of keep happening. So if we actually look at what Jesus does, he demonstrates his authority by acts of power. So he heals people who are sick, he casts out demons, and he does nature miracles, calms a storm. So his identity is being established, right? All these people want to become healed, and this is where he's really telling people, shh, right? Why he tells people to be quiet is a mystery. Scholars love to argue about it. At least in part, I think he's telling them to be quiet because he wants the insiders, his disciples, to understand before he goes public. He needs his team on board, and they're not on board yet. Right? It's part of why he's keeping things a secret, right? So he establishes his power and authority. He draws people to him. So all these people come and want to hang out with him. They're following him. They're hanging around him. Yes, they want to be healed. They want to be around the power too. But he gathers all these people. He picks the disciples to help him do his work. But above all, he says, you're going to be with me. There's this whole theme here of be with me, right? And a third thing is the people in power shun Jesus, right? They're critical. They shun him. They're critical of him, right? The scribes reject him as a blasphemer. The Pharisees are quite critical. He heals on the Sabbath. They accuse him of breaking the law and want to kill him, right? He does powerful deeds, and it attracts some and it repels others, right? His own family even rejects him in chapter 3. They don't really come back till the very end, right? So people in power, the religious authorities, his family, right, shun him. They don't want anything to do with him. In fact, they hate him, right? Which again, if this is a story about following Jesus and being a disciple in the first century, that could happen to you. Your own family could say, what is this newfangled thing you believe? The authorities aren't really happy with it. So again, if we're going to follow Jesus, we should expect that we're going to suffer like him, which is actually what the whole second half of the book is about, right? Is Jesus, there's this big reveal, I'm the Messiah, but you used to think I was going to come and conquer Rome, and Israel was going to become this powerful nation, and we're going to do all these things. Nope, it's not how it works. I'm going to suffer and die, and that's how I'm going to save the world. And if you're going to follow me, that's going to happen to you to a degree too, Bob.
I wonder why, I'm thinking maybe that Jesus specifically used the word Satan, to tell Peter, because Satan's like a tempter, and so he's telling Peter, listen, don't try to tempt me, don't try to convince me to be your kind of Messiah. That's the type of Messiah I am, a suffering servant.
Yep. So in Mark's gospel, we don't get, Jesus goes out into the wilderness, but we don't get actually a story of the temptation. He doesn't tell us what happened, right? Matthew and Luke do, right? But I think he communicates that same concept here, which is just like if we go to Matthew and Luke, right? What does Satan tempt Jesus? He basically says, I'll give you the kingdom if you just bow down and worship me. Right? This can all be over. What you came here to do will be accomplished. Right? Peter's doing the same thing. He's saying, no, this is not how this is going to work, Jesus. It's not the Messiah that we want. And Jesus has to resist the temptation. That's what I actually think part of it is. It's more than just Peter trying to take control. Jesus perhaps is actually tempted. I think that's what's happening. It's a reference back, right?
Interesting that some of our political people are saying that that's what's going on.
Right. So, right, Jesus then now has called these the disciples. They're beginning to understand who he is. What does he call them to do? They're supposed to follow him, and he sends them out. And what do? They're supposed to preach the kingdom of God, exorcise demons, and heal people. But above all, they're supposed to be with Jesus. He's constantly telling. It's this other little theme here of be with me, right? So, part of being a disciple is being with Jesus, right? So again, he's kind of got all these stories of they don't get it, but they're with him, and they very slowly begin to understand who he is, right? But again, I want to point out, if we think about all these stories I've given you on my handout, right? This isn't clumsy. This isn't like bad writing. It's actually really innovative to say, like, let me tell a story about this, like, half miracle. Let me tell the story about how they didn't get it. And it just builds, right, until you finally see this big kind of explosion in chapter 8 of Peter half gets it but doesn't fully get it, and then it's going to develop further, right? So, what he's telling them is they need to hear more. They need to be with Jesus more to more fully understand. Again, so do you and I, right? Another account that will illustrate this is, think about the transfiguration. I don't have this on the handout, but this is the very beginning of chapter 9, right? We get kind of this insider view, right? Well, actually, it's this kind of play, right? What happens in the transfiguration is we get to see, we and the disciples as characters in the story, we get to see Jesus the way the demons see him, in all of his glory, right? He's transfigured, he's white, and there's this shining light, right? Peter, he knows who Jesus is. He's the Messiah, right? What does he want to do? If we call the story, what does Peter want to do? He wants to build shelters. He wants to build booths. That's what it says, but that's basically a tent, right? He wants to build transfiguration land. He wants to build a tourist attraction. We're going to have tents here. People are going to come see all of this. We're going to put it on display. Now everybody will believe. Right? He doesn't get it. It's not how it works. Right? Because again, Jesus isn't this sort of glorious figure we're supposed to put up on a pedestal and adore, right? We're supposed to follow him. We're supposed to do what he does. Right? Yes, we worship him, but that's because we also know who he is. But again, it isn't putting him up on this pedestal. We're supposed to actually actively live our lives in imitation of him, right? And he also, even though he puts Jesus on this pedestal, he also wants to build booths to Moses and Elijah. So he makes two errors. First, he forgets we're supposed to follow Jesus, not adore him, looking up at him. But he also thinks Jesus is equal to Moses and Elijah. Again, Jesus just has to go, Peter, right? And Jesus basically puts an end to the whole thing, right? They fail to understand, right, who Jesus is and what happens afterwards, right? There's this epileptic child, and the disciples try to heal him, and they can't. Jesus has to come along and say, fine, I'll do it, right? It's this a story of they're not quite understanding what's happening, right? So from this point on, right, we kind of get here to chapter 9 and 10. Jesus turns, right? He goes. He says he's on his way now to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer and die there. He knows it. He's talking about it. So what he's actually doing in chapters 10 and 11 to a degree is getting the disciples ready. They still don't get it, but they're beginning to understand more. But he's really preparing them for what's going to happen. Right? These are the other three things passages I have on there. So 3 times Jesus announces what's going to happen. He says, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and I'm going to suffer for the sake of others. Right? So 3 times, all 3 times he tells his prophecies about his suffering and death. They're followed by examples of his followers profoundly misunderstanding, right? And they actually build. They kind of get worse and worse, right? Every time Jesus uses the occasion of their lack of understanding to teach them, teaching us too as the readers or the hearers, right? And each time it gets more explicit, right? So after the second time, that's in 9:33, right? They were talking about, they were basically walking somewhere. Jesus says, what were you arguing about? They're arguing about which one of you is the greatest, which one of us is the greatest. Jesus sits them down and says, whoever wants to be first must be the last of all and a servant of all, right? So again, he's telling them, what does it look like to follow me? Don't try to be the most powerful person in the room. Be the person who goes and serves others, like I'm going to do, like I do, right? Right? He almost always brings kids in. I think this is interesting. Right? He goes, be like a child. Right? What does he say here? He takes... Right, that's part of it, I think, right? But it's also irony. Like, who gets it? The kids get it. The adults don't. Right? Then he took a child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes such a child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who has sent me. Again, serve the least of these, not the ones who are in power, right? The highlight of this is chapter 10, where James and John want to be the greatest. They want to sit at Jesus' right and left hand. Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? They replied, we are able. Right, but again, it's this, we go down to verse 42. This is sort of an encapsulation of Jesus' teaching of the Christian life. He says, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be a slave of all. Then he says, for I, the Son of Man, came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Right? Again, he's telling us, what does it look like to be a disciple? Serve others, especially the least of these. Don't seek power.
The analogy that keeps buzzing in my head as I'm trying to understand is that this is not a lecture. This is a training center.
Yes. I mean, it's a story that you're part of. It's a manual for being a Jesus follower, not a history and here's what Jesus said and did. Right?
There was a story in the news this week that made me really think of what Jesus said to give himself. There was a publisher, I believe in Taiwan, and he of course, the Chinese have been trying to get rid of everything. He ran a publishing business, and he sent his employees away and to be safe, and he himself was willing to be taken, and he has served in solitary confinement in China for almost 1,000 days.
Wow.
His son says his father did this because he wanted to protect the others, and he was willing to sacrifice himself to do that. It made me think of that. The man is a strong Catholic.
Yeah.
But it made me really think of that verse. There's someone who followed and has done it.
Yeah. I mean, again, if we look at these three passages here, this is what he's doing. He's saying, you want to follow me? Here's how you do it. Go deny yourself. Go serve God and other people. Be willing to suffer for the least of these. Go. I mean, that's really what he's doing, right? Yep, Tim.
What is it? It seems like from the outset that this teaching just went away. Because when the church becomes politicized, it seems to me from that, or when that happens, was this not taught for the last 2,000 years?
I think it is taught, but it's constantly covered up. It's constantly corrupted, right?
Because everything became who was first.
Right.
I mean, in the whole history of the church.
Well, in a sense, right?
And the monarch kings who were representative of the church. I mean, that seems to have been the emphasis, like who was first.
So one way to sort of, again, this is going to be a very broad stroke. It's more complicated than this, but if what Mark is doing is the call that Jesus has on all of this, in the early church, this is fairly easy in terms of you're already a small persecuted minority, right? Most of the followers of Jesus don't even have opportunities to really get power. A few of them do, but most of them don't, right? It's fairly easy to say, like, this is who we are. We're going to go serve. And that's actually what attracted people to the movement. We've got all kinds of, like, second and third century reports of other people talking about Christians and basically saying, they're weird. They take care of poor people. They're kind to women. They rescue babies that have been exposed. Why do they do this? But of course, people want to go be there, especially if you're kind of on the down and out. Like, yeah, these are the people I want to go hang out with. They're going to take care of me, right? Well, I mean, the movement grows and gets bigger and bigger, and pretty soon they have some power because of numbers. And Constantine becomes a Christian, or at least privileges it, and the empire turns a Christian. So now everybody believes Christianity is a religion. They think this is what the God is like. They have abandoned the Roman gods. But it doesn't transform society. We still have an emperor. We still have all the power structures of the Roman Empire, right? So people believe that they're saved through what Jesus did, but they don't actually become disciples.
But the history of the church that we know about, it was written by the powerful.
It's also right, yeah.
We do not know all the stories of the little people that actually did live as disciples.
Right, I mean, so just to kind of tease that out, like, you know, a couple hundred years from now, there's going to be somebody teaching church history on the 21st century, right? And First Pres Grand Haven's ministries probably aren't going to play a big role in that history, right? Because they're small. So I think it is worth pointing out, like, we don't know all of the things that average, everyday Christians did. We do know that Christianity got co-opted to a degree by big, powerful governments and empires and these sorts of things, right? And they were superficially a Christian. we don't necessarily know what the average person was doing. It seemed like there were a lot of average people doing it fairly well, right? But I think it also goes back to this point of, right, all of us here in our various roles that we have, and some of us have power, some of us don't. We have power in different ways, right? But we're being called, like Peter, to get it better.
So the growth of the church then is, I guess I see Acts,
Yep.
was based upon the least shall be first,
Yeah.
be like a child. So
I mean, yeah.
should we not emulate that today and maybe
Yeah.
that's why the message that we had, or this message has been so has been so lost in the first shall be first, that we've lost the ability of the church, so to speak, to communicate what that gospel is. I mean, if you, it's like we've got this bell curve and then it grew because it was politically coerced.
Yep.
And now we can't politically coerce belief, though some people may be trying to again. So how is it that we become that church? That has nothing.
That's a huge question, right? Let me.
But I think of that when I'm reading this.
Can I tell a really quick, just sort of historical story? Y'all know who Ignatius of Loyola is? Like, he's the founder of the Jesuits, right? He wanted to go to the Holy Lands and be a missionary to the Muslims. He wanted to walk there. This is like during the end of the Crusades. He wanted to go there on foot and just serve the poor there. And he hoped this would be a way for people there to come to know Jesus, right? Contrast that with the crusades of, here's my sword, confess Jesus or I cut off your head, right? I mean, we're still kind of stuck there of, if you want to go to heaven when you die, follow Jesus. I'm going to do everything I can to force you to do it. We're going to pass laws to privilege Christianity. We're going to enforce what we think of as Christian values using power. Rather than, what we ought to be doing is, who are the weakest, most downtrodden, most oppressed people there are? Let's go take care of them. And through that, right, people will actually see what Christianity is all about, right? That's a small example that I think helps, right? The problem is, we start thinking like, well, we have a building to take care of. We have 2 pastors and their families who need to get paid. Thank you, by the way, right? But I mean, this is what we end up doing, right? And we have to somehow balance that, right? But we've tended to sort of say, let's hoard. Let's make sure that everything's taken care of, and then we'll go help people as we can, right? You know, and so, like, those of you who have been on a session, who are on a session, like, how do we do this? Like, we want to sort of say, yes, we want to stay alive as an institution. We like our endowments of these sorts of things. There's a place for that, right? But we're really supposed to be serving people right now and having confidence, faith, trust that God's going to take care of us. But that's hard. It's a lot easier to say, the bank account's full, now let's go help some people. Bob, you had your hand up.
Well, I think you kind of answered my question. As I tried to serve out in our community, I am running always into this wall of fundamentalist evangelicals who, frankly, are doing what they think they need to do. They are out trying to serve the poor. They're putting their ministers on TV. They are trying to, I think, be true Christians, but it takes a weird bent in that they act very much like Pharisees. You know, we know, you know, how you need to believe. And that, to me, causes a problem. And they are very power-oriented.
Yep.
The man's the head of the family, you can have men serving the church. And so, I mean, I am really trying to navigate that, and it's frankly very stressful. But the bottom line is they are out doing what they think they need to do. We are not, okay? The mainline churches are not putting ministers on television. They're not trying to develop church membership. They're not out serving the poor and the disenfranchised. So I cannot blame the people that are actually out there living their religion, their concept, of Christianity, even in my opinion, it's just my viewpoint, is very Pharisaic. We need to do exactly what you said, is we need to take this very seriously and start getting our own rear ends out there and being true Christians. I mean, there is the stereotype of we don't like to do things, we just like to give money to other people to do them. And this church is very good, but I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, is the mainline churches need to actually get out there and start doing stuff.
Well, I think there's at least a pattern that I think affirms that of, yes, the evangelicals and the fundamentals are out doing all kinds of things. I think the mainline, since the 50s going forward, part of it's embarrassment and a shame. We don't want to be associated with those people. So let's keep our heads down. I think this is a big part of it. We do things. I think we tend to do things too much with just writing a check. The question and the balance is, whatever it is we're out doing, serving the least of these, are we going to wear the cross on a sleeve or not? And personally, I think we shouldn't. I think we should just go help people. And when people ask why, we go, because I think I'm following Jesus, right? Concrete ways that comes out of, we don't have a soup kitchen where before you get a meal, you got to hear a sermon. I think those are the things we should make sure we're not doing. But we do need to find ways that are humble to say, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we're following Jesus. And I don't think we always do that well either. We're so worried about being like the fundis that we kind of hide Jesus under a bushel. Right? Yeah, we're up for time, so we should probably go. But okay, we'll come back and next week we'll talk more about Mark.